In this series, we're going to go over sets and blocks in Magic and talk about what impact they've had on the game and the player base. There may not be a single block that's more well-liked and remembered than the Innistrad block. This gothic horror-themed set is one of the darkest settings in the multiverse, as well as sporting multiple fan-favorite mechanics and cards. Today, we're going to return to our first visit to the plane and answer the question, why does everyone love Innistrad? One of the most jarring things about the plane of Innistrad is just how dire the setting is. As soon as the first set, we're introduced to cards like Victim of Night, depicting a hapless human having a very bad day, to put things mildly. The set is crawling with monstrous creatures such as werewolves, vampires, and zombies. The humans are constantly depicted as fighting for their very lives, with the only help of angels to stave off the monsters constantly trying to kill them. We've gone into more detail on the setting and lore of the plane in the Unknown Side of MTG series, so if you want the full story, you can just start there. For our purposes, the most important aspect of this lore is how the designers tried to communicate the feelings of the plane. Innistrad was one of the first top-down sets, or at least one of the first successful ones. This means that, unlike many other sets where they start with a mechanical idea and design lore around it, for Innistrad, they started with the lore and setting of the plane and designed mechanics to fit. One of the most obvious implementations of this top-down direction are the transformation cards. These are a variation of the old flip cards of Kamigawa, though they were generally received much better. One of the big ways they made this mechanic less bad was by implementing them as double-face cards instead of whatever monstrosity Kamigawa went for. The transformation cards would have one front side with a mana cost, and some way you could transform the card. When transformed, you would physically flip the card over to show the back side of the card, where an entirely new card was waiting to greet you. This shows off one of the biggest advantages of using both sides of the cards for these transformations, as opposed to the old flip cards. You can actually see the art. The transform cards were meant to show off the monstrous transformations of the denizens of the plane. They could show a human turn it into a vampire, or show the dichotomy between the human and werewolf forms and the lycanthropes. It was a pretty great mechanic for a plane like Innistrad that is reliant on showing the differences between two different versions of the same characters, or showing off the body horror of the horrible transformation creatures were subjected to. This mechanic would go on to be so popular that several other sets would return to transform cards as a theme later on. In addition to the transform mechanic, there were three other notable themes that the block tried to implement. We've already mentioned the monstrous theme of the set, which was depicted through a heavy tribal mechanic. The other two themes were very closely tied together, a focus on death and on the graveyard. The reasons for this focus are pretty intuitive. Death is usually a pretty big component of most horror media, and gothic horror is no exception. This led to a lot of cards with abilities that triggered when creatures died, and more importantly, the Morbid mechanic. This was an ability that would turn on if a creature had died this turn, either yours or your opponent's. The graveyard focus of this set follows pretty naturally from deciding to make mechanics around creatures dying. Lots of sets before have had a graveyard theme, so this alone wasn't that unique. However, these themes are often very popular amongst players, and Innistrad was no exception. All of these themes were very successful, at least in terms of being popular with the players, even if they all weren't necessarily good and constructed. Of the three, by far the most impactful was Flashback. This is an ability on instant and sorcery cards. It has a cost that you can pay to cast the card from your graveyard, but afterwards you have to exile it. This is a mechanic that would return for Dark Ascension, but was absent in the final set of the block. This was also a returning mechanic, first showing up in Torment nearly a decade prior. Flashback is a very well-liked mechanic amongst the player base, mainly because it's very powerful and gives players a lot of options when playing. Being able to cast a spell twice gave you an entire extra card worth of value, exemplified easily by Think Twice. This instant costs 1 and 1 blue and simply lets you draw a card, but it could be flashback for 3 mana. This essentially made the card a more flexible divination. It allowed you to draw 2 cards, but at instant speed, and didn't ask for the mana up front. This made Think Twice, as well as plenty of flashback spells, far more powerful than they may seem at a first glance. Looking at Think Twice as a 5 mana draw 2 vastly undersells how effective it was. Not only could you get extra value off of it being milled or discarded by random effects, but you could also choose when was most advantageous for you to use it. Throughout a game, there will often be turns where players will end their turn without spending all their mana, especially after they've top decked under the land they don't need in the late game. Think Twice, as well as most of the other flashback cards, allowed you to have more action in this scenario. You often traded up efficiency for consistency and resiliency. This also leads us into how the cards give the players more options while playing. Since you would have flashback cards in your graveyard, you'd have more cards you could cast on any given turn in addition to the cards that were in your hand. This opens up more lines that you can take, and with more options comes more opportunities to outplay your opponent or make inventive plays. This is also why the community really likes modal cards like the Charms. Helping Flashback out even more is that it was extremely powerful. with multiple cards of Flashback from the set going on to see competitive play. Many of them were simply sideboard cards, such as Ancient Grudge. This was an instant for 1 red mana that simply destroys target artifact and could be Flashback for 1 green. Not only did this make this card a fairly cheap 2-for-1, it was also able to be cast for only 1 mana from the graveyard, which is incredibly cheap, as cheap as most other shatter effects. If you were a deck built around milling yourself, Grudge was probably the best artifact removal in the game. This has led to decks like Dredge, which are built around putting a whole bunch of their deck into the graveyard as soon as possible, to sideboard Grudge consistently. Speaking of Dredge, another card that they played pretty consistently was Gnaw to the Bone. This is an instant for 2 and 1 green that lets you gain 2 life for each creature in your graveyard, and can be a flashback for the same cost. This was also used in Dredge to fight off other aggressive decks by padding their life total. Another graveyard-based flashback spell that ended up really important was Unburial Rites. This is a sorcery for 4 and 1 black that lets you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can also flashback it for 3 and 1 white. These zombify effects are as common as they are usually weak. It's often just too much mana to use on a somewhat niche effect, even if you're cheating out a huge threat. Unburial Rites was one of the biggest exceptions to this rule that we've seen. The combination of being able to be used twice or being able to be used from the graveyard after you milled it made the deck far more powerful and consistent. In that standard, Reanimator was a powerful deck that saw a ton of play by using Grisly Salvage to mill high power threats like Traktusk, and Rites' unique properties allowed it to enable a style of deck that hasn't really seen play in standard sets. The final flashback card from this set that was very successful and constructed was Past in Flames. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. It has the effect where each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback, and their flashback cost is equal to their mana cost. It also has flashback for 4 and 1 red. This card can get you a lot of value, being a pseudo Yawgmoth's Will for 4 mana. If you have enough mana, you could easily use Past to recast several draw spells and removal spells, getting a ton of card advantage. However, like Will before it, it's far better at enabling combos than it is in any fair deck. Past in Flames was used in modern Storm decks. You'd cast a ton of cards like Pyretic Ritual to add tons of mana, then cast Past in Flames to do it again. Eventually, you'd cast enough spells for your Grape Shot to do upwards of 10 damage. And if you could find 2 copies of Grape Shot, or give it flashback with Past in Flames, you could burn your opponent to death in a single turn. This deck has slowly fallen out of favor over the years, as other combo decks have come around and gotten more toys than Storm has. The next named ability in the set was Morbid. This is technically an ability word rather than a keyword. This means that the term Morbid has no rules baggage whatsoever. It is only used thematically to tie the ability together. Unlike most cards that trigger when a creature dies, Morbid was either on or off. It only cares if a creature died, not how many of them. Banshee, for example, was an enter the battlefield trigger that's only on if a creature died this turn. We did mention this mechanic earlier when we talked about Innistrad's Theme of Death. The Morbid mechanic was extremely flavorful. However, it was also a bit weak. Out of the first set, the only Morbid card that really saw any play was Skurdag's High Priest. This is a 1/2 human cleric with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It is an ability where you can tap it and tap 2 untapped creatures you control to create a 5/5 black demon creature token with flying, but you can only do this if a creature died this turn. This is an incredibly powerful ability, especially for such a cheap creature. Unfortunately, its restrictions are equally high. Not only do you have to turn Morbid on, you also need 2 other creatures in play. Morbid's restrictions were sort of perfect in the middle ground between being reliable and being very unreliable. Creatures dying is a very common occurrence, but not something that necessarily happens every turn. Morbid would almost certainly be on at some point in the game, but not necessarily when you needed it to be. To add to this, you had to have 3 different creatures out for Skurdak to work, which meant that you'd either have to kill an opponent's creature or have a 4th creature die in order to make your demon. Even with all of these downsides, being able to make a 5/5 demon when flying is good enough that the card was still able to see play. Priest was basically a must-kill threat, as letting your opponent make even 1 free demon was very difficult to come back from. Worst of all, if you did find a way to kill the demon, that would mean that one of the creatures had died. So Morbid would be again active, and they just have to make another demon. Altogether, this made Priest a very powerful threat, even though it wasn't necessarily the best thing to be doing in that standard. The final new mechanic they introduced in the set were Curses. This is a subtype enchantment that would appear in auras, and while it didn't have any specific rule baggage, all curses would attach themselves to players as opposed to permanents. These curses would give the player a variety of negative effects, such as Curse of Oblivion slowly eating away their graveyard. This wasn't the first time we had seen auras at enchanted players, such as cards like Paradox Haze having been printed in the past. This was, however, when they were formalized and became even remotely common. Nowadays, basically any aura that attaches to a player will be a curse. While they have gotten more common, that doesn't mean that they're particularly good. Curses are generally underpowered. Wizards seems to be very cautious with the effects they put on curses, usually being a bit too conservative with their power level. This may be due to the fact that they're enchantments, which several colors have a hard time answering. No matter the reason, the result is that we have a lot of cards that are just good as opposed to being great. The only curse of note in the first Innistrad set would be Curse of Death's Hold. This is a 5-mana curse that gives all creatures enchant player controls -1/-1. This is a very powerful effect that can often stop someone's entire deck. Lots of low-to-the-ground aggro decks rely heavily on 1-toughness creatures, and Death's Hold can answer all of them in one fell swoop. Even if they have larger creatures, shrinking all of them permanently can easily allow you to win combat. This effect scales well against opponents who play more creatures, and is of course automatically worse against decks that play few to no creatures, like control decks. So it's probably no surprise that the card was much more successful in sideboards than main boards. It did see some main play in mid-range and control decks, however, just because of how strong it was against creature spam decks. Besides Curse of Death's Hold, however, none of the curses in Innistrad itself saw much constructed play. Innistrad, like most first sets in a block, is a fairly large set, with a total of 264 cards, though that number does include things like basic lands. For those less aware, back in the days of the 3-block structure, the first set of a block was designed to be able to be drafted by itself. But as the later sets were released, they would also be included in drafts. For Innistrad specifically, Dark Ascension would be drafted alongside Innistrad, but the final set in the block, Avacyn Restored, was meant to be drafted alone. This larger card pool was meant to give more structure to drafts, though in modern day, most limited environments consist of only one set, so this number of cards is pretty standard nowadays. Now that we have the context of Innistrad's design, we can look at how its limited environment played out. As time went on, Wizards would get more heavy-handed with limited themes, with so-called signpost uncommons being common build-arounds for their 2 color pairs. Innistrad, however, lacked these characteristic, obvious build-arounds in the first set. Instead, what would normally be a focus on tribal limited set, the tribes themselves took something of a backseat to synergies between individual cards and general drafting principles. Things like tribal lords were largely absent from the original set and weren't introduced until later on the block. That's not to say the tribes didn't have any synergy at all. The 5 tribes each had their own themes that they tried to aim for. Out of the 5, humans had the easiest time acting as a normal tribal deck. Humans were green and white and had go-wide themes. Cards like Hamlet Captain were the closest thing to a tribal lord at low rarity in the set, and lords always benefit the most when you have a high number of creatures. Unruly Mob would grow anytime any of your creatures died, which triggered more of your creatures. On top of this, most of the humans were fairly cheap, giving you a low aggressive curve. This made humans one of the few tribes that you could just try to grab as many members from to pump with Hamlet Captain and play aggro. The next tribe were spirits, which could be found in blue and white. However, the main payoff for the deck was Intangible Virtue, which would give all token creatures +1/+1 and vigilance, allowed to attack without tapping. The deck had a lot of token generation with cards like Doomed Traveler, Malizium Guard, and Midnight Haunting. You may have noticed that 2 of these cards are humans, which meant that they could also be played in the humans deck. This is where the looseness of early Innistrad draft came in. Cards could easily be played in several different decks. All the werewolves were humans on their front face as well, meaning that they usually worked for the human decks. The next tribe were zombies, who were found in blue and black. This deck was very graveyard focused. The blue zombies had a mechanic where you had to exile cards from your graveyard to cast them, but they had above average stats, especially for blue creatures. Black had several cards that let you recur your zombies easily. Vampires were found in black and red. Their most common mechanic was getting +1/+1 counters whenever they dealt combat damage to a player, representing them gaining strength from drinking blood. Finally, the last tribe were the werewolf transform cards, and they all had the same transform condition. The front side would transform during your upkeep if no spells were cast last turn, and the werewolf side would flip back if a player cast 2 or more spells last turn. Now, we've made a failed cards and mechanic videos about this subject before, and while it's not great, it's worth mentioning it was much better in limited. Decks were clunkier and slower, so you had more turns where someone might not cast a spell, and more turns to flip your wolves. While the tribes are the most obvious limited theme, Innistrad had a number of uncommon build-arounds like Burning Vengeance that synergized with cards in the set regardless of the tribe. Probably the most famous of these build-arounds was Spider Spawning. This is a sorcery for 4 and 1 green that creates a 1/2 spider with reach for each creature card in your graveyard. It was also a flashback for 6 and 1. Considering how graveyard focused this set was, it wasn't hard to make a good number of creatures in your graveyard. Getting 5 or 6 spiders off of a single spawning allowed you to put on a lot of pressure on your opponent. Reach also allowed you to stop any attacks in the air, which made trying to get around the spiders almost impossible. Combining this with Spawning's Flashback made it a great payoff for a graveyard-focused deck. On the opposite end of the spider spawning, a card that people loved in Limited, there's the Bane of Innistrad Draft, Invisible Stalker. This is a 1/1 human rogue with a mana cost of 1/1 blue. It has hexproof, meaning it can't be targeted by your opponent's cards, and it can't be blocked. This means that your opponent basically can't interact with Stalker at all. While it is only a 1/1, you can obviously get around this by just making it larger with auras or equipment. By throwing a few cards like Butcher's Cleaver or Demon Mail Hallberg, you could just kill your opponent in a few swings. There were exactly 3 cards in the set that could answer Stalker: Tribute to Hunger and Lilian of the Veil, which could force your opponent to sacrifice a creature, and a Blasphemous Act, which deals 13 damage to each creature. Both Lilian and Act were rares, meaning they weren't likely to show up in any one particular draft. So there was only one card that meaningfully could answer Stalker, and they can get around it by just having more than one creature. This strategy of suiting up a cheap hexproof creature with buffs is strong enough to compete in some constructed formats. So it was way too good for a format like Innistrad Draft, which had a much lower power level. The only answer to Stalker was trying to race them, which they could often counteract with removal or the life gain off of Butcher's Cleaver. So Stalker is not remembered fondly by Limited players, to put things mildly. Changing gears from Limited, we're going to be moving our eyes to Constructed and talk about some of the most important cards in the set, the Mythics and the best rares. As far as Constructed goes, players generally open packs just for the rares and Mythics. So a set having powerful cards of high rarity is really important for evaluating how worth opening it is. While having a few bad rares is part of the course, Mythics are often more make or break, so they'll be getting special attention. White received 2 Mythic rares, Angelic Overseer and Mycaius the Lunarch. Angelic Overseer is a 5/3 angel with a mana cost of 3 and 2 white. It has flying and the ability where, as long as you control a human, it has hexproof and indestructible. Essentially, while you had a human creature, it was impossible to remove. This could be incredibly powerful, but any card that needs another card in play to do anything special is suspect. The stat line was only good, so you really wanted a human in play when you were casting your Overseer. It could be difficult to remove if you're playing creatures like our limited Destroying Friend Invisible Stalker, but this was best against control decks who would be loading up on things like Counter Magic, which Overseer was horrible against. Overseer did see some play, but it was generally outshined by other threats. Mycaius the Lunarch was a 0/0 legendary human cleric with a mana cost of X and 1 white. He comes down with X +1/+1 counters, and you can tap him to put a +1/+1 counter on him. Or tap Mike and remove a +1/+1 counter for him in order to put a counter on all your other creatures. This combination of abilities made Mycaius a powerful threat for aggro decks. You could easily play him after developing a board for about 3 or 4 mana, and then on the following turn use his ability to pump your entire board. Or you can play him out on turn 2 and just tap him every turn to slowly make a huge creature in the event that you didn't draw a lot of small creatures, or if you just didn't have a better turn 2 play. This made Mycaius a fairly successful piece for aggro decks. Moved on to blue, it received Mirror Mad Phantasm and Scab Ruinator, neither of which were all that good. Phantasm was a 5/1 with flying for 3 and 2 blue. It has the very weird ability where you can pay 1 and 1 blue to shuffle it into your deck. Then you reveal cards atop your library until you reveal a card named Mirror Mad Phantasm. You put it onto the battlefield and the rest into your grave. Essentially, this was just a very roundabout flicker. This would let you do things like dodge removal or just mill a random amount of cards if you wanted to. However, the most interesting thing about Phantasm is how you can abuse the ability. If you only have one copy of Phantasm and you use a clone on Phantasm, then activate the clone's version of the ability, you'll shuffle it into your deck and then try to find a Phantasm. However, since the clone's name isn't Phantasm once it gets shuffled into your deck, you just mill every card in your library. This is neat, but was never really worth doing, because it meant you had to run it as a one-of, so any combos you could do would be very inconsistent. Still, Phantasm is certainly a unique card, even if it isn't all that strong. On the other end of things, Scab Ruinator is a 5/6 zombie horror with a mana cost of 1 and 2 blue. However, as an additional cost to cast it, you have to exile 3 cards from your graveyard. It has flying and the ability where you can cast it from your grave. Ruinator may look like a powerful card, but it, like most of the Scabs, were completely ruined by one word: creature. Scabs could only be made with creatures in your graveyard, which made them far more difficult to actually cast. Even creature-heavy decks would usually be playing around 20 creatures on average. In order to have 3 creatures in exile, you'd have to mill far more of your cards than you expected at first. Even if you could cast it eventually, the main upside of Ruinator was being a giant creature you could cast on turn 3. The fact that you couldn't actually do that consistently pretty much automatically killed any potential the card had. Black received an above average number of mythics, though most of them weren't all that great. Reaper from the Abyss is a 6/6 demon with flying for 3 and 3 black. It has Morbid, specifically at the end of each step, if a creature had died, you get to destroy target non-demon creature. Reaper was fine. It had okay stats and potentially useful abilities, but that wasn't enough for a 6-mana creature this time. It fell into the tired old trap of expensive card that doesn't do enough when you play to be good against any fast decks. If it always destroyed a creature when you played it, like future cards such as Noxus Gearhulk did, it would probably have seen some play. However, when you cast Reaper, there was a good chance that it wouldn't be getting its Morbid trigger that turn, and your opponent could just remove it or attack for lethal next turn and ignore it. It was just too difficult to ensure you would both have the mana to cast Reaper and be able to actually get its ability off, especially considering there was the possibility of you being forced to start destroying your own creatures. The next mythic was Army of the Damned. This is a sorcery, the mana cost of 5 and 3 black, with the effect where you create 13 tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. It could also be flashbacked for 7 and 3 black. This card is just bad. While it would end the game if you managed to cast it, it was too slow to be practical. Any aggro or even mid-range deck could easily erase a deck trying to use this as its win condition, and control decks would just wrath away your board next turn. Flashback didn't really improve the card, as you weren't casting that card once, let alone twice. If the card didn't make the zombies tapped, it likely could have seen some play, as they could at least block and keep yourself alive after hitting 8 mana. However, it may have been too good at that point, which is why this downside was tacked onto the card. After 2 disappointing black mythics, we're onto the star of the show, and one of the best cards in the entire set, namely 1 Lillian of the Veil. This is a planeswalker for 1 and 2 black. It has 3 loyalty in the abilities, where you can +1 to make everyone discard 1 card, -2 to make target player sacrifice one of their creatures, and a -6 that you rarely go to, but would be devastating if you did. This allowed you to split all permanents target player controls into 2 piles however you wanted. Then your opponent would have to sacrifice all the cards in one of those piles. Every ability on this card was good. Sure, the +1 was symmetrical, but you would choose when it happened, and you could build your deck around it. The -2 made Lillian a great removal tool, and one that could eat several creatures if not answered immediately. The ultimate is as game-winning as most Planeswalkers' ultimates were, but that's not really what makes or breaks most Planeswalkers. Lillian was so good against so many decks that she still sees play to this very day, though over time she has started to be eclipsed by other cards. Red got 2 mythics. One is Past in Flames, which we've already talked about. The other red mythic was Balefire Dragon. This is a 6/6 dragon with flying for 5 and 2 red. It is the ability where, whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals the same amount of damage to all their creatures. This is a very powerful card, but it suffers from the same fate as Reaper from the Abyss. It costs too much mana. And while it can wreak havoc on your opponent's board, it just takes an entire turn to do so. Without haste, a static ability that messes the game, or a triggered ability that you can use right away, cards of this cost almost never have the opportunity to do anything. Moving on to green, the first mythic was Essence of the Wild. This is a 6/6 avatar with a mana cost of 3 and 3 green. It has the ability where all creatures you control enter the battlefield as copies of Essence of the Wild. So if you use a card like Raise the Alarm to make 2 1/1s, instead you'll get 2 more massive 6/6. Unfortunately, this card was a bit too clunky to ever see play, similar to Balefire Dragon and Reaper from the Abyss. At least those cards could impact the game on their own. Essence of the Wild relied on other cards to be able to accomplish anything. The card would really need to be cheaper. Even being a 4 mana 4/4 with the same ability would have allowed it to possibly see play, as that's a pretty major upgrade to any tokens you make. The other green mythic was a lot more impactful, and once again, it's a Planeswalker. Garruk Relentless is a 3 loyalty Planeswalker with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. He has 2 abilities that cost 0 loyalty to use. You can either make a 2/2 green wolf creature token, or deal 3 damage to target creature, then have that creature deal damage equal to its power to Garruk. This is a strange set of abilities, though they make more sense considering Garruk also has the ability where it will transform if it ever has 2 or few loyalty counters on him. He flips over into Garruk the Veil Cursed. This one can +1 to make a 1/1 black wolf with Death Touch, meaning any creature it hits will always be destroyed. You can -1 him to sacrifice the creature, and if you do, tutor out any other creature card. Finally, you can -3 him to give all of your creatures trample and +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. Garruk was a slightly complicated but very powerful planeswalker. You could either play him as a creature factory or as a removal spell on turn 4, and if you were lucky, you would transform into his backside, which was a nightmare to deal with. Making a death touch creature every turn makes combat a nightmare. And if they ever let up pressure, you could just tutor up a new threat with its -1. Garruk was extremely successful, though he didn't have quite the same staying power as Lillian did. There was one mythic artifact in the set, Grimoire of the Dead. This is a legendary artifact for 4 mana. You can pay 1, tap it, and discard a card to put a counter on it. And then, when you have 3 counters on Grimoire, you can tap it and sacrifice it to put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield. They're all now black zombies in addition to their other types and colors. This card was far too slow to ever see play. While it did have a massive ceiling, Cards like Unburial Rites were far more practical thanks to not having to wait 4 turns to actually get the creatures. Finally, we move on to the 3 multicolor mythics. First off is Geist of Saint Traft. This is a 2/2 legendary spirit cleric with a mana cost of 1, 1 white, and 1 blue. It is hexproof, and whenever it attacks, you make a 4/4 flying angel creature token that's tapped and attacking, but you exile it after combat. This was one of the best threats in this set. While its stats weren't actually great, it effectively swung for 6 damage. And with 4 of that being flying, it was hard to ignore. Hexproof made it very difficult to remove as well. You would often have to rely on trying to kill it in combat, but your opponent wouldn't just let you kill their guys for free. Generally, the card was used in tempo decks that would use cheap removal to clear the board and beat you down in just a few turns with creatures like Geist. Worst of all, the best answer to Geist's Saint Traft was Geist itself. You see, at this point in Magic's history, the legendary rule worked very differently. Instead of making it so that you could only control one legendary permanent of a certain name, if 2 players had a legend of the same name, they both had to sacrifice it. This meant that every legendary creature was also a removal spell for other Geists, as weird as that is. Geist was so well known that it would be referenced in future sets to the plane and time again. The next mythic was Olivia Voldaren. This was a 3/3 legendary vampire for 2, 1 black and 1 red. It has flying and the abilities where you can pay 1 and 1 red to deal 1 damage to another target creature. You permanently turn that creature into a vampire and put a +1/+1 counter on Olivia. Finally, you can also pay 3 and 2 black to steal a vampire from your opponent. Olivia was just an incredible mid-range threat. While it was a bit weak up front, it could easily clean up boards of small creatures while growing huge. And if your opponent played only 1 or 2 good creatures, Olivia would turn them to the side of vampirism and leave you in an even better spot. Sure, it did take a lot of mana, but considering just how terrifying Olivia was on an open board, it was a must-kill threat. Finally, the last multicolored mythic was Grimgrin, Corpseborn. This is a 5/5 legendary zombie warrior with a mana cost of 3, 1 blue, and 1 black. It enters the battlefield tapped and doesn't untap normally. Instead, you can sacrifice a creature at any time to untap it and put a +1/+1 counter on it, and whenever it attacks, you destroy target creature your opponent controls and give it another +1/+1 counter. While this card can be extremely powerful, it was unfortunately a bit slow. 5 mana is hitting the range of needs to do something right away to be played. Grimgrin might have been able to get around this, but requiring creatures to sack to keep up and running meant that it could often be a bit bricky. It was best in creature spam decks focused on sacrificing their own creatures, and unfortunately, those decks had better cards to use than Grimgrin. This card isn't exactly bad, more just unnecessary and worse than other cards decks had access to. And that's every mythic in the set. And as usual, they're very hit or miss. Cards like Lilian of the Veil and Geist of Saint Traft were incredibly powerful, and historically, Lilian commanded an incredible price tag. However, about half the mythics were just fine, a bit too expensive and clunky to really find a home in Standard. The highs were high enough and numerous enough, though, that it's fair to say that Innistrad had an above-average mythics for a set. Finally, Innistrad had a lot of other very powerful cards for Constructed, some of which we've already talked about in the Limited section. Intangible Virtue, while a good card in Limited, was also a very powerful pump spell in Constructed formats. Token decks in Standard and even in Modern use the card to pump out a ton of damage on turn 1. Doomed Traveler was played a lot in these decks as well, as paying 1 mana for what was essentially 2 1/1s was very strong. Another powerful white aggro card was Champion of the Parish. This is a 1/1 human for 1 white that has a +1/+1 counter whenever a human enters the field under your control. Not only was this good in Standard, it was strong enough to still see play in Modern and Legacy, at least when humans was a playable deck. It was probably the best turn 1 play in the deck, as it would very quickly become a huge threat that you had to kill before it ran over you. It's a threat that any tribe would be happy to have. Stony Silence was an enchantment for 1 and 1 white that made it so that no one could activate the abilities of artifacts. This is a stacks piece that can completely shut off certain decks. If you're relying on cards like Walking Ballista as part of a combo, or cards like Steel Overseer to pump your board, Stony Silence could stop those cards from doing basically anything. Artifact-focused decks are good in a number of formats, and as a result, Stony Silence has seen tons of play to stop them in their tracks. One of the most infamous cards from Innistrad is, of course, Delver of Secrets. This is a 1/1 for 1 blue that lets you get the top card of your library during your upkeep. If it's an instant or sorcery, you can reveal it and flip Delver into an Insectile Aberration, a 3/2 with flying. Considering how good instances and sorceries are, it wasn't hard to play a deck full of them and flip over the Delver in the following turn almost every time. A 3/2 with flying was way above rate for 1 mana, making Delver one of the best threats not only in blue, but in the game for years after its release. Even now, after being power crept by cards like Dragon's Rage Channeler, it still sees playing Legacy as one of the main threats in a tempo deck. Playing perfectly alongside Delver is Snapcaster Mage. This is a 2/1 for 1 and 1 blue. It has Flash when you cast at instant speed, and when it enters the field, you give target instant or sorcery in your graveyard Flashback. Its Flashback cost is just its mana cost. This lets you cast any spell in your graveyard a second time on top of getting a 2/1 body. This was another card that saw play for years, being a staple in blue decks ever since it was printed. Recasting Lightning Bolt or Mana Leaks was more than enough to win games in Modern for several years after Snappy's printing. Sure, the stats weren't all that great, but the versatility it gave you, being a copy of every instant or sorcery in your graveyard, on top of being able to fight for the board, made it great in mid-range and control decks. It has also seen less play as late thanks to power creep, but it still shows up every now and then. While not the biggest competitive card, Blasphemous Act is one of the most heavily played cards from the set. This is a sorcery for 8 and 1 red. It costs 1 less for each creature on the field, and deals 13 damage to all creatures. This is a very powerful board wipe, though it's much better in formats that are a bit slower. You need the board to get a fair number of creatures out, so that's only a 5 mana to cast, at which point it's a more than fair wrath. However, it's probably most famous for Commander, where it's consistently a 1 mana board wipe. Witchbane Orb is a card that players may overlook, but has seen a surprising amount of play. This is an artifact for 14 mana that destroys all curses attached to you when it enters the battlefield, and also gives you hexproof. The main reason this has seen play is because it's the cheapest artifact with the you have hexproof ability. This makes you immune to cards like Thoughtseize and Lava Spike, among many others. Being an artifact is important as well, as it allows it to be grabbed off important artifact searchers like Karn the Great Creator or Whir of Invention. While it was meant to give players an out to curses, it ended up being far stronger than the designers probably thought it would be. Finally, the last important cards for constructed from the set are a cycle of utility lands. Gavany Township could be tapped for a generic mana, like all others in the cycle, but also lets you pay 2, 1 white and 1 green to put a +1/+1 counter on all your creatures. Moorland Haunt lets you pay 1 white and 1 blue, tap it and exile a creature card from your graveyard to make a 1/1 white spirit creature token. Nephalia Downyard lets you pay 1, 1 blue and 1 black and tap it to make target player mill 3. Stentia Bloodhall lets you pay 3, 1 black and 1 red and tap it to deal 2 damage to target player. And finally, there's Keswick Wolfrun. This lets you pay X, 1 red and 1 green, and tap it to give target creature +X/+0 and trample until end of turn. Every single one of these cards saw some competitive play, and some are absolutely all-stars to this day in formats like Modern. Utility lands don't have to do all that much to see play, as their main job is just to make mana and provide some, well, utility in a pinch. All of these lands, however, have very powerful abilities that you can use in the late game to win a game. Township not only lets you push through more damage, but if your opponent doesn't answer it, eventually it will make them so big that you can easily swing for game. Haunt give you a constant stream of tokens in the late game to keep pressuring your opponent or just chump block. Drownyard could be used to get more resources in your graveyard in the late game, or try to mill at your opponent if the game went on long enough. Bloodhall could burn your opponent for the last few points of life if you couldn't quite kill them, and Keswick Wolfrun could break board stalls by making a creature huge and giving it trample. All these effects are strong enough to make these cards powerful in Standard. However, Wolfrun is interesting thanks to actually seeing play as part of a combo deck. Primeval Titan is an incredibly powerful card that shoots any 2 lands out of your deck whenever it enters the field or attacks. Not only does this let you make a lot of mana, it can also end the game pretty easily thanks to lands like Wolfrun existing. After getting a ton of mana off of Titan, they would sometimes find Wolfrun to pump its power to astronomical levels and hit for game. Overall, it's pretty much the most played card of the cycle, though none of the other cards would be completely discounted. The only one that hasn't seen some modern play is Bloodhall, just because it costs so much to activate that it's hard to use in a format so fast. That's all the busted cards from Innistrad, and as you can see, there's a lot of them. Innistrad wasn't a broken set. It didn't lean to tier 0 metagames in Standard. It did, however, contain a lot of very powerful cards and not only saw play for years afterwards, but some of which still see play to this very day. It was a home run in terms of power level, being strong but not so good that it overshadowed everything around it. And that was Innistrad, the first set of the Innistrad block. Looking back on it, it's easy to see why it's so beloved. While Limited Environment had its flaws, it was one of the best limiteds the game had seen up to that point, and set the standard for the format going forward. In terms of constructed, this set introduced a ton of powerful cards at almost every rarity. In the Planeswalkers as Chase Mythics, things like Snap Chaser and the lands at rare, they were both immediately powerful. Of course, just the power of the cards alone doesn't explain why the set was so beloved. The lore and look of the plane also struck a chord with players. Innistrad really sold the feeling of a dark, foreboding plane full of terrifying creatures and evil magic. It also had tons of designs that were extremely flavorful. Transform cards were a bit controversial at the time, but they pretty quickly won the player base over. Innistrad set up the rest of the block extremely well. So next, we'll take a look at Dark Ascension and Avacyn Restored to see how well they stuck the landing.